So, hello everybody. I'm here today with Emillie. Is it Parrish? Is that how you pronounce your name?
Yep.
Parrish. So, Emillie Parrish, she lives on Vancouver Island. She's an island-dwelling fermentation enthusiast. Now, Vancouver Island, for those of you that don't know, is in British Columbia, in the same province of Canada that I'm in. Emillie is a freelance food writer and a columnist, and she's the creator of the website Foodies.com. So, she's here today to talk about fermentation because fermentation has become Emillie's specialty. And so I wanted to dive a little deeper with Emillie in what she's doing with fermentation, how she got started. And I think you'll be interested in hearing her story. So Emillie, to you, when did you start fermenting and why are you interested in it?
I first started fermenting about 4 years ago. Actually closer to 5 years ago. And I came to it because my doctor actually recommended it. Everybody in my family was having health issues. We had eczema, food intolerances, and it was when my second child was born, and I was starting to introduce foods to her. And all of a sudden, she was reacting to different foods from my son, and I was like, I can't do this. I can't have two kids that have different food allergies in my household. And she suggested that our issue was actually in gut health and that we needed to start eating more probiotics and specifically fermenting foods. I'll admit she's a medically trained doctor, but definitely always up for alternative remedies. And so I looked into the research behind it. There was a lot of really convincing evidence that having a healthy gut biome might help a lot of the problems we were suffering with. So I went and made it my New Year's resolution to start eating something fermented every day and feeding it to my kids. And I think it took us about 2 years to clear up most everything, but it's unbelievable. My son had allergies that he'd been diagnosed with an allergist, and he has outgrown them or, matured out of them. I feel very strongly that fermentation has helped with this. Yeah.
Are there any areas of food like gluten or dairy that you don't use?
I personally stay clear of gluten. That's because I'm hypothyroid, and there's a lot of evidence that it's linked to Hashimoto's hypothyroid. But other than that, I ferment pretty much everything. I'll admit I haven't fermented meat. I know you can. I'll leave that to somebody more adventurous. But yes, otherwise I do vegan, non-vegan, pretty much everything. Yeah.
Is there anything else in your diet that's special, that's not normal for, say, the North American diet? Do you like avoid junk food or anything like that?
Oh yeah. Yeah, sorry. We do I try to feed us a microbiome diet, or one that will feed our guts. So to have a healthy gut bacteria, they basically live on fiber. So when you eat whole grains or resistant starches, they don't necessarily have to be in grains. They can be Jerusalem artichokes, have really high fiber nuts, beans. So we eat a higher fiber diet, and we also try to avoid sugar. Of course, I have kids, so that's not entirely possible, but they're not sweet tooths, and I think that's partially because we don't eat a lot of sweets around the house. So, yeah.
So can you address just your education? Did you go to university to learn this, or do you have a background in microbiology or anything like that?
I have I went to grad school for neuroscience. So while it's not directly linked, I definitely have a firm grounding in biology. And I actually worked in the healthcare industry for a number of years as in several different hats, either working with individuals who had very complex care needs and needed a specialist to come in and help with that. And then later on, I went and became a planner. So I have a big healthcare background as well as a science background. So yes.
So did you do a lot of like research, downloading scientific papers to learn this, or where did you learn to do it?
I definitely keep up on the research. It's every Monday I sit and look through the news and try to share a few interesting articles. When I share them, I try to find something that's not too deep in science, but like easy for everybody to read. But I definitely have that as a background. And in terms of figuring out the microbiome diet, I can't think of exactly where that came about. Probably, again, just research and a general understanding of how our body functions. Yeah.
So can you go a little deeper into the microbiome diet? What does it entail? Like, what would your family eat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner on a typical day?
So I will say there are a number of microbiome diets that you can get books out, and they all have different theories about whether you should have dairy or not. I really am just a proponent of a simple, healthy food diet. If you were following the food guide, this is the sort of diet you would eat. We start breakfast with, actually I make a sugar-free granola that we eat most days. Sometimes we eat hot cereal or waffles or eggs and toast, just regular stuff, but the goal being no sugar in our breakfast. Often breakfasts are very sweetened. If you're just buying off-the-shelf cereal,
right,
they're, quite a dose of sugar. Lunches for my kids, they can choose to make their own sandwich or they'll have leftovers from the dinner the night before. We eat a fairly vegetarian diet. We call ourselves flexitarian. We eat meat maybe 2 or 3 times a week, but mostly eat like a vegan or vegetarian just to get a lot of whole grains. And
okay, what's a typical dinner? Like chili or?
Yeah, exactly. So this week we've had chili, right on with that. Last night we did a soup that I call, basically it's a lazy cabbage roll soup. Instead of folding the filling into the cabbage, I just chop the cabbage into the filling. Tonight I think we're gonna have shepherd's pie that I'm actually pulling from my freezer because I'm not home to cook dinner this evening. Yeah, so our general meal plan is to have a meal that we can put together fairly quickly during the weekdays, and then on the weekends we make a huge batch of something and freeze extras. So yeah, so we eat a lot of soups and
where do you fix your fermented food in that? Is it like pickles on the table or yogurt for breakfast, or how does it work?
So I don't know if are you gonna have a video of me in the webinar? Okay, so I'll show you what I've got going on right now. So I can't really turn the camera around. So here I pulled out some of the stuff I've got going right now.
We can see that.
Every morning we make milk kefir. So we have milk kefir every morning for breakfast. And then we have yogurt for dessert. Half the time I didn't bring the yogurt out. This is some cider vinegar I have, and I have sauerkraut. And then I made specifically for this some ginger bug, which is a treat, and that'll be a treat for us for Christmas to have a little bit of sparkling sweet beverages. I do make a lot of fermented like vegetable sticks that the kids can take for school or for snack. We do kimchi quite often because actually if you make a few large jars of kimchi, even if it takes you a few weeks to eat it, it's such a quick and easy meal. You can literally just add it to a stir fry or to soup, and it adds a whole burst of flavor and a bit of probiotics. But I will say that most of our daily probiotics probably comes from milk kefir and yogurt.
Okay, that's good for people to know, like how to fit it in, because you're thinking about, so what am I making for dinner, but you're not thinking, and how can I add something fermented? Because of course, if you heat it, it's going to kill the probiotics in it, right? So that's great that you explained that.
Yeah.
So what's the relationship between fermented food and gut health? Like, how does it work?
It's complex in that I guess traditionally we all would have had really healthy guts. We wouldn't be taking antibiotics. We wouldn't be eating our high carb, low fiber diets. That's sort of typical in our Western culture. We also would have naturally fermented foods as a means of storage. If you didn't have a refrigerator to store food in, you had to ferment. So I put up fermented pickles every year, and I have a whole bunch in my cupboard, and they can last all winter without, needing to be preserved. Sauerkraut lasts about, well, I don't know, maybe it lasts more than a month. We always eat it. So it's just a way of storing food that would have been more traditional. The same with milk. Actually, if you were taking raw milk, which I don't have access to, but if you had access to raw milk, it already contains a bacterial culture. Milk naturally would ferment into yogurt or a kefir-like drink. The longer you leave it, the more it ferments. So I think traditionally we would have had a lot of exposure to fermented foods, and now we don't. And only that, we prevent any bacteria from entering our world. So we spray down our counters with antibacterial spray. We wash our hands with an antibacterial wash. All of that is removing bacteria from our diet. So adding it back in with fermented foods is probably the most effective way to reculture your body. In part because taking a pill, the bacteria there's not a ton of evidence that probiotics make it through. There's a reason why BioK, I don't know if you've seen it, is like $20. It's effective. Bacteria in a dairy culture specifically is shown to make it through the digestive system. It's one of the best ways, but any type of, like if you're eating it with your meal, it's the most likely to culture. Also, if you culture in your home, so like if you're making sourdough and sauerkraut in your home, you're actually creating a flora for your air and in your environment in your home. And I think that really helped in our family with a lot of the eczema, because now our home, it's really easy for me to ferment something. I know beginners struggle quite a bit because their flora in their house doesn't contain all the right lactic bacteria and yeasts to make fermentation possible. So the more you ferment in your home, also the healthier you will be. Like you will have the good cultures on your skin, in your lungs, as well as eating.
So that's a really good point you're making, that the more often you make your own ferments at home, the more healthy your indoor air is going to be. And then that takes care of some of the health things that goes on in a family, like eczema you mentioned. That's a really good point, because some people think that, I can just go to the store and buy my kombucha or buy my sauerkraut, and I don't have to make it at home. But the point you're making is that it's really important to actually get your hands dirty and do the stuff.
Also, buying it is great too, like if you really don't have time to ferment. But I think sometimes fermentation is one of those things where if you haven't done it before, it seems really hard. But sauerkraut is so easy. It literally takes like 10 minutes to make. And if you do it once, then you'll see that it's actually quite simple.
What would you recommend for a beginner to do if they've never done any fermenting before and they're just starting out? Where should they start?
Probably depends on what they're interested in eating. Often sauerkraut is a great one, or kimchi, or anything with cabbage, because cabbage has its own lactic bacterial culture. So unlike if you're trying a more exotic ferment, even if the air in your home is not great for fermenting, the cabbage comes with its own culture, and usually people are successful. The other good one to do is if you can eat dairy. A lot of people like yogurt and milk kefir, so those ones are good to do as well. And yogurt, you actually can just buy a tub of yogurt from the store and use that to make more yogurt. You don't have to go out and buy a specific culture. I recommend buttermilk too. Most of the time when you're buying buttermilk in the store, it's cultured buttermilk. It's not actually leftover from butter making.
Right.
And so it's a really great probiotic culture, and it's quite sweet. So if you're not used to the sourness of, or you don't really like sour yogurt, you can make cultured buttermilk with a store-bought buttermilk.
So you recommend that people start with dairy if that's something they can tolerate and it's part of their diet?
In part because I think people can naturally see how to add yogurt to their diet. Yeah. Otherwise, I recommend sauerkraut. If they're up for a salty condiment, I love sauerkraut. So
how often do you make your own sauerkraut? Is it a once a month thing in your house or every week?
Definitely not every week. I kind of change it up. We make a few different kinds of sauerkraut. So I'm trying to think, maybe once a month, and I rotate it. I had one jar out, but I actually have 2 jars in the cupboard.
Okay.
I let them ferment for about a month before we eat them. So yeah.
And you just keep them at room temperature. You don't refrigerate.
Once we start eating, I refrigerate them just because there's a greater risk of contamination once we start sticking a fork in there.
Right.
Otherwise, I have a cool closet. I don't have a garage. If I had a garage, that would be a great place for fermenting. You want it to be about 18 degrees, but I have a closet that's attached to the outside of my building, so it's kind of cooler than the rest of the house. Yeah.
So when you say
And dark.
When you say 18 degrees, you mean 18 degrees centigrade, not Fahrenheit, correct?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, sorry.
We have a lot of audience that are from the United States. So just want to clarify that's 18 degrees centigrade, which is what, about 65? So how did you get your kids to eat ferments? Is that something they just grew up doing so it was natural, or did you have to, coax them or hide it?
Well, I started fermenting when my daughter was probably 8 months old. So she's always had it, but my son was already 4. So maybe that's why I suggest dairy. He likes dairy. He likes fermented pickles like, cucumbers or carrots. They're not super big on kimchi. Well, my son isn't super big on kimchi even now, even though he's been eating this kind of stuff for 4 years. My daughter has always eaten it, so she absolutely loves it. Yeah. So I think just think about what your kids enjoy. And actually, if your kids are real sweet tooths, then there's nothing wrong with starting with some kombucha or water kefir or, a fermented beverage. The reason why I made gingerbug is, starting with kombucha can be a bit of a barrier, either finding the SCOBY, because you have to buy a culture or find a culture to start with. And you also have to maintain that culture and keep feeding it. I personally love gingerbug. You can do it with turmeric, but the ginger, by the time you're done making it, if you want to make a spicy ginger ale, you have to add more ginger because it's mostly not as spicy. But I love it because I can decide, I want sparkling beverages for like a week from now. It just takes me 5 days to make a culture using nothing but ginger and sugar. Again, ginger with the skin on, like organic, naturally has its own bacterial culture that it brings. Yeah.
So when you make a gingerbug, you leave the skin on the ginger or do you peel it?
No, I don't. I just grate it with the skin on. I use an organic ginger. Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I have not made a gingerbug yet. I do kombucha. We have like a continuous brew 2.5 gallon vat, but I haven't tried gingerbug. Is it something that like you have to keep starting fresh, or is it like yogurt where you take a starter and put it in to get a new batch going?
Yeah, if you keep feeding it, you just probably like kombucha, where you do a continuous brew, but if you were to remove a little bit of the kombucha tea and make a flavored kombucha, you'd still have your original brew.
Right.
Gingerbugs like that, you can remove, make a little to drink, and then just feed it again if you want to keep it going.
So so
you can keep gingerbug going?
So you have to put fresh ginger in as well, or just more sugar?
Both ginger and sugar. It needs the ginger. Yeah.
So it's a little bit like sourdough, making sourdough. You add the water and the flour every time. Okay.
Yes, exactly.
That's really interesting. So back to picky eaters, what do you do with an adult that isn't interested in pickles, or is there a way to combine it so that they can be more receptive to it? I have a husband that will not eat pickles.
Right. Will not eat like salty fermented foods. I make a lot of recipes where, like, one of my favorite ones is I make a sauerkraut soup, and it's like a traditional sort of German soup, and then I throw sauerkraut in at the last minute. So I don't know if you're really anti-sauerkraut, like my kids can find an onion in anything. You know, if you're that level, or you're pulling out every single little one, then it won't work for you. But just adding it to meals, like I understand eating a forkful of sauerkraut on its own might not be appealing, but you could put it into a Reuben sandwich, or, you know, a place where the bright, salty flavor of sauerkraut is balanced by something creamier, you know, to try and take the,
Hey, that's a great idea.
Oftentimes, mixing flavors is tasty.
So is there any particular ferments that you're going to use at Christmas or Thanksgiving, like festive kinds of ferments that are always on your table, traditional?
Well, so I have the ginger bug, and I'm going to brew some cranberry ginger ale, which is traditional in Canada. I don't know if it's in the States. But for that, I'll just take some of the ginger bug and mix it with cranberry juice. And I might add a little apple juice to sweeten it, and it'll become a bright red sparkling beverage that is pretty fun. I also do a fermented cranberry sauce. I know that you posted a fermented cranberry sauce recipe last week, you were saying. So I also have there. You can do sweet or savory. And then we talked about dairy ferments. So I like to do two different things. I like to make flavored butters. I know that this is a herb group. So it's easy to make butter. And if you want to make cultured butter, which is very trendy and expensive, all you need to do is culture some whipping cream with a little bit of buttermilk or kefir. And then you just take a mason jar, and it's about maybe 10 minutes of shaking to get the butter to separate. And it's really fun. If you have family around, you guys can all take turns. We do it. That one we actually might do once a month, just because cultured butter has this delicious savory flavor, and it's a perfect place to add herbs. If you have anything from your garden that you have, it just really makes something special beyond just the typical to spread on your bread at Christmas dinner. Yeah.
What kinds of herbs would you stick in that? Say if you were going to make that, and how long in advance would you have to start? Would that be something you'd make 2 weeks ahead, or?
Well, you could, but I mean, you really could do it 2 days in advance. To culture, if you used buttermilk or something, that's just an overnight culture. Then you whip up the cream the next morning. I like adding, well, it's not really the season for basil, but if you thought ahead and had some dried, I like basil with garlic. I like mixed fresh herbs like chives and parsley in there. Depending on what you're cooking, you could do a sage butter if it went with your dinner. Sage butter is really good with like butternut squash. Yeah.
That sounds great. Would you do like a sweeter butter, like cinnamon or ginger butter or anything like that?
Yeah, you could definitely do like cinnamon toast, perfect cinnamon toast butter. You could even stir some honey into that if you wanted to make a sweet breakfast treat. Yeah. And
then that's
a good idea.
That would still give you probiotics for your microbiome, right?
Yes.
Even though it tastes
technically exactly. And but it's not the best way to get your probiotics, because you'd only use like a tablespoon, right? Yeah, but it's delicious anyways. Yeah.
So how much fermented food would someone in your family eat in a typical day? Would it be like a quarter cup or half a cup, like spread throughout the day?
Well, all of our dairy is fermented. Like, it's a treat to get unfermented dairy around here. So we definitely get probably like a cup of fermented dairy. And then in terms of the fermented vegetables, maybe like a quarter cup serving.
So about a cup and a half total. And do you also take, like probiotic, I don't know what they're called, like
supplement?
This is the one I have, Love Bug
Right.
probiotic. So do you also take this, or is all your probiotics coming from food you eat?
At this point, it's just from the food we eat. Yeah.
And that was enough to reverse your health issues?
Yeah, I had actually tried with probiotic supplements with my daughter right away because it was quite clear she was having a lot of digestive issues, but she actually wasn't tolerating them. So we just started into the fermented.
Do you actually serve like sauerkraut when you have guests over, or how do you get guests to eat them? Or do they go, ooh, because this has bacteria in it?
No, I don't know. My friends definitely all eat fermented foods. If it's one of the dishes I'm serving them. One of my, honestly, kimchi is one of my favorites. I often am serving dishes with kimchi, and nobody seems to think anything of it. But I live in a place where you can buy kombucha on tap most everywhere. Like, it's kind of that style of community. So
nice. So what you're saying is you live in paradise and I should move.
It's just, yeah.
So my next question, I think you've already answered. I said you have local support for fermenting, and you said you live in a community where kombucha's on tap. So that's pretty amazing. Do people in your farmers market have like sauerkraut for sale and things like that?
Definitely. There's a lot of local producers of fermented foods. I can think of at least 4 restaurants that that make fermented foods and are like quite proud of it. And some of them you can buy stuff from them. Yeah. And we even have our own Facebook group for culture sharing in Victoria.
Wow, that's amazing.
So I know.
I've changed a lot.
Supported.
That's amazing. You have your blog, foodies.com, and you write a lot about...
It's Fermenting for Foodies.
Oh.
Sorry, it's Fermenting for Foodies.
Fermenting for Foodies. Sorry about that. It wasn't linked on my notes. So fermentingforfoodies.com. And so you have recipes there, is that right?
Yeah, so I have sort of 2 focuses. One is like the pure fermentation, like how to make sourdough, sauerkraut, as well as recipes that are healthy. And I write them for anybody, even people who aren't necessarily into fermenting, but I always try to include a way of adding probiotics to the dish.
Awesome. So that sounds like a great resource for our readers. And then are there blogs or podcasts that you listen to about fermenting?
I don't listen to any podcasts. There's a few bloggers like yourself that I sort of regularly follow. So Joy Belief Farms, Grow, Forage, Cook, Ferment.
Oh, Colleen, she does a really good job with fermentation.
Yeah. Attainable, Sustainable, and Practical Self-Reliance. Those are sort of the ones that spring to mind as just really good resources.
Okay, I'll put those in the show notes so that people can get links to that. And so do you have any projects coming up in 2020?
I want to do more fermenting with Japanese ferments, which is the koji kin culture. I've done miso and I've done like a fermented rice drink, but I'd like to try and make soy sauce and other ferments. And then you can actually use miso to ferment vegetables and things. I want to try a few more Japanese ferments. I'm also actually starting a new blog. I don't know if that fits here. Sure. I haven't officially launched it. It'll launch in January. And that is because my husband and I are slightly crazy and we bought a piece of property on an island that doesn't have anything on it. Basically, there's people on it, but there's no hardware store or anything. So we're going to have to build ourselves something from scratch. And I was like, God, I should blog. So I decided to expand it beyond that scope. And it's just going to be about sort of like West Coast living,
Nice.
but with that sort of earthy and healthy aspect to it. So I can tell you the URL, but at the moment it's live. It's just I haven't even written a blog post on it yet, so still creating it.
Okay. Well,
do you want that URL?
Sure.
Or
the URL. I'll make sure it's in the show notes.
Okay, it's berriesandbarnacles.com. My first post goes live tomorrow.
Nice. Very nice. And then do you have a favorite fermenting book that you would recommend?
So I brought out I have gone through quite a few, but these are my favorites. So Wild Fermentation, of course, is Sander Katz. He's like, you have to, if you ferment, you have to own this book. And I like, because I do a lot of fermenting, like in the beginning, I actually bought Fermenting for Dummies, but I'm kind of beyond that now. But I love this book. It's called Mastering Fermentation by Mary Carlin. And I love it just because the recipes are more about, have that foodie aspect to it. They're a little bit more complex. And I actually brought out my Joy of Cooking. And I have like a super well-used Joy of Cooking. And the Joy of Cooking does all basic, like a lot of basic ferments. It just, that's what they do. They do everything, right? You can find a recipe for anything, the original basic recipe for it. And so it's perfect, like if I needed to look up, like, how did they ferment this, in like 100 years ago, like the Joy of Cooking kind of still covers that aspect of things. Yeah.
I had no idea. I've got Joy of Cooking and I did not know that they covered ferments. That's a wonderful piece of information.
Yeah. Well, they would do like basic things like sourdough and they just, yeah.
Very cool. Were there more books that you wanted to share with us?
Nope, that's it. I have my cheese making.
And do you teach in-person fermenting classes in Victoria?
I don't, but I have 2 friends who do teach fermenting, so I'm not like getting in on their their game.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are definitely people doing that, not me.
How can people find you online? Through your website, fermentingforfoodies.com. And then is there anywhere else that they can find?
I have a Facebook page and Instagram and Pinterest. They link on my website if people are interested. Yeah.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. This was very informative. I learned a lot. I've been fermenting for probably 30 years, but I learned quite a bit from what you shared. So thank you very much for that. And I will make sure that our audience gets in the show notes your proper website, fermentingforfoodies.com, and also links to your social media. And thanks for joining us.